Apple, the quintessential American technology giant, has woven itself into the very fabric of the global economy, becoming a symbol of innovation. Yet behind the polished glass lies a complex relationship with China. It represents the core of Apple's entire operational strategy. A multi-decade bet that has yielded unprecedented profits while simultaneously creating unparalleled dependencies. How did the most valuable technology company on Earth become so profoundly reliant on its home country's primary geopolitical and economic rival? Apple's entire supply chain is fundamentally anchored in China. Apple's fate is inextricably linked to the political whims of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. This precarious position suggests that Apple has, in many ways, been captured by the very system it helped to build. This documentary explores the journey of how Apple actively engineered it. It's a tale that reveals Apple as one of the most significant foreign actors propping up the CCP regime. We will dissect what it means for the future of technology, global politics, and the delicate balance of power. Apple's deep integration with China is a sensitive topic. To understand this relationship, we have to travel back to 1999 when Apple's future was uncertain. At that point, Apple's products were manufactured outside of China. The transformation over the following decade was born out of desperation. In 1996, Apple was on the brink of collapse. Apple was losing the personal computer war to competitors running Microsoft Windows. This forced a radical shift in thinking, embracing the outsourcing model. Apple turned its gaze toward Asia. Han Hai Precision Industry, better known as Foxconn, would change the game completely, building a manufacturing empire in mainland China. Terry Gou, the founder of Foxconn, built the empire required to produce Apple's products. He played an indispensable role in catalyzing China's industrial ascent. Gou understood the future of manufacturing lay in colossal economies of scale. In the late 1980s, Taiwan lifted its restrictions on trade with mainland China. Simultaneously, Deng Xiaoping was creating special economic zones and inviting foreign investment. Terry Gou seized this opportunity. He recognized the mainland's vast potential of low-cost labor and government support. He built entire cities dedicated to manufacturing, like Foxconn City in Shenzhen. Gou accelerated China's industrial revolution, laying the groundwork for the country to become the world's factory. The rise of Foxconn was linked to Apple. In 2000, Foxconn secured its first major contract assembling the iMac G3. This success led to Apple shifting its production to Foxconn's Chinese empire. The iMac G3 proved the Foxconn model worked. Apple found a partner capable of translating its designs into mass-produced reality. The turning point arrived with the iPod. In 2001, Apple launched the iPod, revolutionizing the music industry and Apple itself. Skyrocketing sales stretched Apple's manufacturing. They needed a partner who could scale production rapidly. Terry Gou was ready. In 2003, Foxconn was awarded the iPod contract. The iPod was smaller and more intricate, requiring precision assembly and massive volume. Foxconn met the challenge, expanding production and hiring thousands. The iPod's success solidified trust between Apple and Foxconn. This cemented Foxconn's position as Apple's go-to manufacturer. As Apple diversified, it entrusted more to Foxconn. Apple became deeply entwined with Foxconn in China. No other company offered the same scale, speed, cost-effectiveness, and engineering flexibility. The supply chain center of gravity shifted to Shenzhen. In 2007, Apple prepared to launch the iPhone, a device that would transform the company and the world. The challenge wasn't just design, but manufacturing millions of flawless devices at unprecedented scale. Foxconn, led by Terry Gou, bet everything on the iPhone, building massive factories and hiring hundreds of thousands before a single phone was sold. The gamble paid off. The iPhone became Apple's flagship, and Foxconn secured a near monopoly on its assembly. Foxconn's iPhone City in Zhengzhou grew to over 300,000 workers, symbolizing China's central role in Apple's global dominance. This partnership was only possible with a third, silent partner, the Chinese Communist Party. The stage was set for a new era, one defined by scale, ambition, and hidden costs. Foxconn's rise wasn't just about business acumen, it was powered by the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP provided Foxconn with tax breaks, cheap loans, and land smoothing every obstacle. Why? Embedding Apple in China meant a transfer of technology, capital, and influence. The CCP's strategy made Apple so dependent on China that it would help build China's future. This support came at a cost. The government enabled labor exploitation, suppressing worker rights for strategic gain. The China model was never just about economics, it was a calculated move in a global power play. Inside Foxconn, relentless efficiency ruled, long hours, low pay, and strict discipline. Workers lived in crowded dorms, always on call with little privacy or rest. International outrage over these conditions forced Apple to promise reforms, but little changed. The CCP allowed this exploitation, not just for jobs, but to make China indispensable to Apple and the tech world. Once Apple was hooked, China gained leverage over supply chains, technology, and the future of global electronics. The real goal, use Apple's success to fuel China's own rise. The plan worked, almost too well. As China's economy soared, Apple found a new goldmine, not just in factories but in Chinese consumers. The iPhone became a status symbol, and Apple's sales in China exploded, at times surpassing the US. Apple's dependence deepened. It now relied on China for both manufacturing and market growth. Foxconn and Apple thrived, China gained jobs and technology, and the CCP's vision seemed realized. But beneath the prosperity, Chinese workers paid the price, exploited for the benefit of all. The model looked perfect, but its foundation was fragile. The cost of this success was about to become impossible to ignore. The dark side of the China model surfaced: underage labor, forced student work, and a string of suicides at Foxconn. Foxconn's response: install safety nets, not real reform. Reports of forced Uyghur labor further implicated Apple in human rights abuses. Apple's apologies and audits couldn't fix a system built on exploitation, enabled by the state. The CCP's strategy was clear: allow exploitation to gain leverage over Apple and the West. But with Xi Jinping's rise, the era of quiet cooperation ended. Political control tightened, and Apple's dependency became a trap. The true cost of the iPhone revolution was finally exposed. The fragile equilibrium that had allowed Apple to flourish in China was shattered with the ascension of Xi Jinping in 2013. The new leader brought a more assertive and nationalistic vision to the forefront, and the era of quietly tolerating Western corporate dominance was decisively over. The Chinese Communist Party began to flex its muscles, and Apple found itself in the crosshairs. The first major salvo was fired just a day after Xi's inauguration, on China's annual Consumer Rights Day. This state-managed media event, broadcast on the powerful CCTV network, traditionally singles out one company for public shaming. In 2013, Apple was the chosen target. The state-run media launched a coordinated and relentless attack, accusing Apple of providing inferior warranty policies to Chinese consumers. While the accusation was factually dubious, the truth was irrelevant. The campaign was not about consumer rights. It was a power play to demonstrate the party's authority over the American tech giant. When Apple tried to issue a public correction, it was a grave miscalculation. This only intensified the media onslaught, with newspapers, television programs, and government officials joining the condemnation. The pressure became immense, and Tim Cook was forced to capitulate. He issued a deeply humbling public apology, expressing sincere apologies to Chinese consumers and professing immense respect for China. Cook announced Apple would revise its warranty policies in China, making them superior to terms offered in the United States. This was a watershed moment. It signaled a fundamental shift in the relationship. The party had bent one of the world's most powerful corporations to its will, forcing a public display of submission. This was not an isolated attack but the opening move in a broader campaign. Under Xi Jinping, the party systematically used its power to extract concessions. In 2014 alone, 30 foreign companies were targeted. Qualcomm was hit particularly hard, forced to pay a $1 billion fine and coerced into joint ventures with state-owned enterprises. This was a mechanism for forced technology transfer, allowing Chinese partners access to valuable intellectual property. With Facebook and Google already blocked, the message to Apple was crystal clear: cooperate or face the consequences. To navigate China's political waters and avoid the fate of companies like Qualcomm and Google, Apple shifted from business partner to collaborator in the CCP's agenda. This led to the Gang of Eight, a team dedicated to managing Apple's relationship with the Chinese government. Their core realization: help the CCP achieve its strategic goals. This marked the beginning of Apple's Great Surrender, involving a massive transfer of manufacturing and expertise. By 2015, Apple was channeling $55 billion annually into China. This is almost double the annual spending of the US CHIPS Act. Apple's investments played a pivotal role in building China into an economic and technological superpower, primarily through the education and training of Chinese workers and engineers. Apple's investment focused on educating a vast Chinese workforce. Apple trained an estimated 28 million Chinese individuals. A significant portion were highly skilled engineers. Apple dispatched engineers to China to teach advanced manufacturing. This knowledge transfer reshaped China's industrial landscape. Tim Cook noted China's vast pool of tooling engineers, dwarfing the US. Apple employs more engineers in China than in the US. Apple became the largest educator of high-tech manufacturing engineers in China. These engineers became a valuable national resource, spreading expertise to universities and domestic companies. This spurred China's technological development. Apple also supported a comprehensive domestic supply chain, increasingly state-controlled. This strengthened China's tech sector, but also made Apple's departure nearly impossible. The massive transfer of manufacturing capability and engineering knowledge did wonders for China's economic statistics, helping to propel its GDP to heights that brought it tantalizingly close to that of the United States. However, the true significance of this industrial buildup goes far beyond economic figures. As one of America's founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, wisely observed centuries ago, the independence and security of a country are fundamentally linked to its manufacturing prowess. Manufacturing is not just about creating wealth and jobs, it has a dual use. A nation that excels at building complex consumer electronics also possesses the foundational skills and infrastructure needed to build advanced military hardware. This dual-use principle is at the heart of the CCP's long-term strategy and represents the most dangerous consequence of Apple's deep integration with China. While an iPhone is obviously very different from a guided missile, the underlying technologies, machinery, and expertise are not as far apart as one might think. The sophisticated computer numerical control machines that are used to mill the precise aluminum casings for MacBooks and iPhones can be reprogrammed to manufacture critical components for fighter jets, drones, and missile systems. The expertise in creating vast, robotic assembly lines for mass-producing millions of phones can be readily adapted for wartime production of military equipment. Furthermore, the logistical genius required to manage a global supply chain that delivers hundreds of millions of high-end products on a tight schedule each year is directly transferable to military logistics. The ability to source components, manage inventory, and coordinate complex production schedules is as vital for an army as it is for a corporation. Most importantly, however, is the human element. The tens of thousands of world-class engineers that Apple trained in fields like materials, science, robotics, and precision manufacturing now constitute a talent pool that can be leveraged by China's military-industrial complex. These are the individuals who can design and build the next generation of advanced weaponry for the People's Liberation Army. This was precisely what Xi Jinping envisioned all along. In 2015, he launched the Made in China 2025 initiative, a strategic blueprint designed to transform China from a low-cost manufacturer into a high-tech powerhouse dominant in key industries, including aerospace and defense. A decade later, it is clear that Apple's investments and knowledge transfer have provided an enormous boost to this agenda. The communists have a famous saying often attributed to Lenin: "The capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them." In the case of Apple, it appears the company not only sold the rope, but provided detailed instructions on how to braid it, demonstrating how to build a world-class manufacturing base that could one day be turned against its own home country. Apple's concessions to the Chinese Communist Party began to accelerate, moving into areas that struck at the very core of the company's brand identity. Apple would make a series of decisions prioritizing its access to the Chinese market over its commitment to user freedom and privacy. In 2017, Apple removed VPN applications from its App Store in China, essential tools for bypassing the Great Firewall. Apple became an active participant in reinforcing the CCP's digital fortress. Apple announced it would store iCloud data for its Chinese users on servers within China, managed by a state-owned company. Apple was effectively handing the CCP the keys to the private data of millions of its Chinese customers. More recently, Apple removed popular messaging apps like WhatsApp and Threads from its Chinese App Store. Apple has become an active enabler of the CCP's censorship and surveillance apparatus. Apple's bargain with Beijing is now pressured by Washington. As US-China relations sour into a trade and tech war, Apple is caught in the crossfire. China, once ideal for manufacturing, now poses a vulnerability. The US government aims to counter China by restricting technology exports, encouraging companies to bring manufacturing home. This puts Apple in a difficult position, squeezed between US demands and dependence on China. Tariffs pose a financial risk. A conflict over Taiwan would collapse Apple's business model overnight. Apple relies on Taiwan's TSMC for chips. A war would sever this supply line, halting production. China could weaponize its control over Apple's assembly operations. For Apple, a war over Taiwan represents a doomsday scenario. Faced with geopolitical and financial risks, Apple aims to diversify its manufacturing footprint, reducing dependence on China. The primary strategy is shifting final assembly to low-cost markets like India and Vietnam. This move de-risks the supply chain and hedges against US-China tensions. By 2026, Apple aims to assemble most iPhones sold in the US and India. Partners like Foxconn and Tata Group are expanding production capacity in India. However, this move to India is an illusion, addressing the visible problem but not Apple's core China dependency. While the box may say assembled in India, most high-value components are still made in China. Assembling iPhones in India doesn't solve Apple's China problem. The company remains dependent on Chinese suppliers. Even if Apple were to move its entire supply chain out of China, will the Chinese government even allow it to leave? Apple is trapped by its physical assets within the country. The company has billions of dollars worth of property, plants, and equipment on its books. Beijing has de facto control over these critical assets, making it incredibly difficult for Apple to move this machinery. This creates a hostage situation. Another barrier is the human capital that Apple has cultivated in China. This massive, skilled workforce is concentrated in China and cannot simply be relocated. Finally, there is the risk of intellectual property theft. The risk is that in trying to leave, Apple would simply be leaving behind perfect blueprints for its Chinese rivals. Faced with criticism and geopolitical realities, Apple has launched a public relations offensive, showcasing its commitment to the United States. The company pledged to invest a colossal $500 billion into the US economy over the next 4 years. However, a closer examination reveals a pattern of recycled pledges geared towards generating positive headlines. Apple's promise will create a mere 20,000 new jobs in the United States. This skepticism is warranted when we look at Tim Cook's track record of similar promises. It seems that every time a new US president expresses concern over China, Apple rolls out a new, bigger investment promise. These repeated announcements appear to be a strategic PR stunt rather than a concrete plan to fundamentally alter its business model. The real work remains firmly anchored in China. Putting aside the skepticism, is moving Apple's manufacturing to the US even possible? The economic realities of American manufacturing present obstacles for a company of Apple's scale. Labor costs are a significant barrier. US wages are much higher than in China, impacting iPhone production costs. Apple's business model relies on China's low-cost labor. It's unclear if the iPhone could exist if produced entirely within the US economic framework. Where would Apple find the hundreds of thousands of manufacturing employees needed? There is no comparable pool of manufacturing labor in the United States today. The supply chain for electronics doesn't exist in the US at the necessary scale. The dream of Made in the USA clashes with the reality of what the US economy can provide. Amidst these daunting challenges, there is one technological development that offers a potential, albeit distant glimmer of hope, for reshoring manufacturing advanced robotics and automation. As robots become more sophisticated, dexterous and intelligent, the reliance on a large low-cost human workforce could diminish significantly. In theory, a factory of the future could be run almost entirely by machines, with only a small number of highly skilled technicians needed to oversee and maintain the automated systems. This would dramatically reduce the impact of high labor costs, making it more financially viable to locate factories in developed countries like the United States. For a company like Apple, this is honestly an intensely appealing prospect. A highly automated factory would neutralize the primary advantage that countries like China, India and Vietnam currently offer. The cost of electricity and capital for robots is relatively similar across the globe, meaning the wage differential between an American and a Chinese worker becomes a much less significant factor in the overall cost of production. Apple could, in this scenario, build state-of-the-art lights-out factories in states like Texas or Arizona, staffed by a small number of American engineers. This would not only solve the labor cost and supply issues but also shorten supply chains, reduce geopolitical risk, and allow Apple to proudly stamp "Made in the USA" on its products without sacrificing its profitability. This vision of a robotics-led manufacturing renaissance is compelling, and Apple is undoubtedly investing in the research and development necessary to make it a reality. However, we are still a long way from this automated utopia. While robotics have made incredible strides, the assembly of a complex and delicate device like an iPhone still requires a level of fine motor skill, adaptability, and problem-solving ability that currently eludes even the most advanced machines. Many of the intricate tasks, such as connecting fragile ribbon cables or applying adhesive with perfect precision, are still best performed by human hands. Fully automating the entire iPhone assembly process remains a monumental engineering challenge. Therefore, while robotics may one day allow Apple to bring manufacturing home, this is a long-term solution, not a short-term fix. For the time being, and for the foreseeable future, the company will continue to need a significant human workforce. This means that, for now, it makes far more sense from a purely economic standpoint to continue moving assembly operations, not to the United States, but to other low-wage countries like India and Vietnam. The strategy is to chase cheap labor while slowly building the component supply chains in those regions. What Apple is unlikely to admit publicly is that this diversification process itself will take years, if not decades, to complete in any meaningful way. The core dilemma for Apple is that it is caught in an unwinnable race against time. The geopolitical clock is ticking much faster than the slow, grinding process of relocating a global supply chain. While the company takes small, incremental steps to diversify assembly to India and Vietnam, the risks associated with its China dependency are growing exponentially. A potential conflict over Taiwan, or a sudden drastic escalation in the United States-China trade war, are not distant possibilities. They are acute risks that could materialize with very little warning. Apple's diversification efforts, which will take the better part of a decade to make a strategic difference, may be rendered moot by a political event that happens next year or even next month. The reality is that Apple may already be too late. The company has spent a quarter of a century embedding itself so deeply into the Chinese industrial ecosystem that a rapid extraction is impossible. It is not just about moving factories. It is about disentangling a web of dependencies that includes suppliers, engineers, logistics, physical assets, and a massive consumer market. Each thread of this web is a roadblock, and the Chinese Communist Party holds the power to tighten them at will. Apple's strategy of slowly building an alternative in India is a sound long-term plan, but it is a plan hatched in a world that assumes stability and predictability. A world that no longer exists. For now, and for the foreseeable future, Apple has a massive and intractable China problem. The company is trapped by its own spectacular success. The very strategy that propelled it to become the world's most valuable corporation has now become its greatest vulnerability. It cannot stay in China without facing immense political pressure from the United States and the constant threat of being used as a pawn by Beijing. Yet, it cannot leave without incurring catastrophic financial losses, abandoning billions in assets, and spending a decade rebuilding what it has lost. It is a strategic checkmate from which there appears to be no easy escape. This story of Apple in China, as detailed in Patrick McGee's book, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company, serves as a crucial case study for the modern world. It highlights the profound risks of deep economic integration with an authoritarian rival and the hidden costs of globalization. The choices Apple makes in the coming years will have repercussions not just for its shareholders, but for the future of technology, international relations, and the global balance of power. The company that taught the world to think different must now find a different way forward before its time runs out. Apple's intricate saga in China culminates in an unsettling conclusion. The world's most innovative company has become a captive of its own creation. Through a pursuit of profit, Apple built its empire on Chinese manufacturing. This is a defining narrative of globalization, intertwining Western capitalism with Chinese authoritarianism. Apple's journey is inseparable from China's rise, creating geopolitical vulnerability. The allure of China's labor and market proved irresistible. Now Apple operates at the pleasure of a regime that can cripple its operations. The consequences extend beyond Apple's balance sheet. By transferring knowledge, Apple contributed to the technological potentiation of a rival. This serves as a cautionary tale for the globalized world. Apple's predicament highlights a clash of values. It's a mirror reflecting compromises made for economic expediency. This is a story about the future of global power. Looking forward, Apple's path is fraught with peril. Squeezed between geopolitical tensions and its dependency on China, diversification efforts proceed slowly. A conflict over Taiwan, tariffs, or Beijing weaponizing its supply chain could trigger a corporate cataclysm. This makes its situation potentially existential. The question is whether substantive change is possible, or if Apple is destined to manage its slow decline. Its next chapter will be written by choices made in this crisis. The answer will determine the fate of one of the world's most iconic companies. In the great game of nations, there is no purely economic decision.